From a biological standpoint, sleep is arguably the most hazardous activity a person engages in on a routine basis. It is not skydiving or driving that poses the greatest risk, it is sleep itself. For approximately 1/3 of your existence, your muscles relax completely, your perception of your surroundings nearly vanishes, and you turn into a helpless, unmoving stockpile of calories lying exposed. To a predator surveying the terrain for an easy target, a person asleep is nearly the equivalent of a meal handed over for free. So the actual puzzle isn't why early humans avoided solitary sleep. It's why so many people today assume that sleeping entirely by themselves, sealed off in a private room with the door shut and no other person within reach, is somehow the natural way to do things. Let's begin with the most obvious factor behind this ancient behavior, one that spans nearly the whole of human existence. Predators don't pause their activity just because darkness has fallen. In fact, many of the creatures that historically posed the greatest danger to people, including big cats, hyenas, and various pack hunters, tend to be far more active and successful during the darkest hours, exactly when human eyesight is weakest and human reflexes are slowest. A lone sleeping person represents nearly the ideal scenario for a predator, someone who is entirely oblivious, entirely still, and entirely without anyone close enough to sound an alarm or step in. Sleeping as part of a group completely alters this equation. Having multiple bodies present means multiple sets of senses are working, even if only partially, which greatly boosts the chances that anything approaching the group gets spotted before it gets close enough to cause harm. This links directly to something sleep researchers have found genuinely interesting. Human sleep is not a single uniform condition of unconsciousness. It moves through several distinct phases, some far lighter and easier to disrupt than others. Within a group of people sleeping together, each individual will naturally be at a somewhat different point in their own sleep cycle at any given time, simply because of normal variation in when each person drifted off and how their particular sleep stages are unfolding. As a result, a group sleeping together maintains a kind of continuously shifting layer of partial alertness through the night, without anyone consciously arranging shifts or forcing themselves to stay awake. At any moment, someone in the group is statistically more likely to be in a lighter stage of sleep, and therefore easier to wake by an odd noise or movement, unlike a solitary sleeper whose vulnerable period has no backup whatsoever. Studies of present-day hunter-gatherer groups have uncovered something that takes this concept even further, showing evidence of deliberate, at least partly conscious watchfulness woven into communal sleeping setups. Research on groups such as the Hadza and various San communities has shown that even within shared sleeping areas, certain people tend to rouse periodically over the course of the night, sometimes to tend the fire, sometimes just to stay briefly alert before drifting back to sleep, forming a kind of unplanned rotating watch across the group that doesn't demand any one individual give up their full night's rest. This isn't some formally scheduled guard duty. It seems to arise naturally from the rhythms created when several people sleep close together, yet the practical outcome closely resembles an organized watch rotation, achieved through biological coincidence and physical closeness rather than deliberate planning. Let's turn to fire, since it adds a genuinely significant layer to this discussion, something we touched on previously when talking about ancient shelter. Groups sleeping together were often arranged around a central fire, and keeping that fire going through the night required at least some occasional attention, adding fuel, adjusting its position, and making sure it didn't burn out during the coldest, most dangerous stretch of the night. A sleeping arrangement centered on a shared fire naturally generated more chances for exactly the kind of scattered, periodic wakefulness already described. Someone had to tend the fire regardless, and that same brief waking moment doubled as an opportunity to scan the darkness around the group for anything approaching. In effect, the fire and the sleeping group formed a single combined survival mechanism, with light and warmth spreading outward while the clustered bodies offered shared heat and overlapping watchfulness. Now let's return to the subject of body heat, something we've mentioned before in relation to shelter, but which deserves its own attention here as well, since regulating temperature during sleep was a serious survival issue on its own, separate entirely from the threat of predators. Human body temperature naturally dips a bit during sleep, as part of the body's normal regulatory process, but that drop becomes far more dangerous in cold surroundings without an outside source of heat. Sleeping in direct physical contact with other people provides passive warmth throughout the night, without needing any conscious effort or the constant fuel supply that keeping a fire burning requires. For ancient people living in places with genuinely cold nights, sleeping alone wasn't only a matter of safety from attack, it was also a real and measurable risk to maintaining body temperature, one that sleeping in a group effectively and efficiently resolved. Now let's bring in something genuinely interesting that ties into broader historical sleep patterns. Because it turns out that how ancient and even pre-industrial people actually slept looked quite different from the single, uninterrupted 8-hour stretch that most people today think of as standard. Historical documentation from various pre-industrial cultures, together with studies of populations living today without electric lighting, describe a pattern researchers refer to as segmented sleep. This involves a first period of sleep, followed by a stretch of wakefulness in the middle of the night that could last an hour or more, and then a second period of sleep before dawn. Historical accounts describe people using that middle waking period for quiet activities, conversation, and even social interaction, all within the setting of a shared sleeping space. This pattern fits far more naturally into a group sleeping arrangement than it would for someone sleeping alone. That midnight waking window became a chance for quiet bonding, casual conversation, or simply checking that the group was safe, rather than just being an isolated and slightly annoying break in an otherwise solitary night. This brings up a genuinely worthwhile question. Is there actual evidence linking this ancient communal sleeping pattern to measurable differences in sleep quality or duration compared to today's more isolated sleeping habits? A team led by sleep researcher Jerome Siegel carried out an important comparative study of sleep patterns across several present-day hunter-gatherer and pre-industrial societies, including groups located in Africa and South America who have very little exposure to artificial lighting or fixed schedules. Interestingly, the study found that these populations did not necessarily sleep for dramatically longer stretches than typical modern populations, which goes against an earlier assumption that people before industrialization must have simply slept more overall. What the researchers did discover, though, was a strikingly consistent sleep-wake rhythm closely aligned with natural light and temperature cycles, along with comparatively low reported rates of insomnia in these communities, even without any of the sleep aids or controlled sleeping environments that modern populations often depend on. This points to the idea that the real distinction between ancient and modern sleep may lie more in consistency and quality than in sheer length of sleep. And group sleeping arrangements likely contributed meaningfully to that consistency and quality, beyond the security advantages already discussed. Let's turn specifically to children, because sleeping alongside infants and young children is one of the most widespread and consistently documented sleeping practices found across a huge range of traditional and ancient cultures, and it connects to some genuinely important practical and developmental factors beyond basic safety. Infants and small children have far less developed systems for regulating their own body temperature, are more exposed to nighttime dangers, and historically needed more frequent feeding and attention during the night than older children or adults did. Being in close physical contact during sleep let caregivers respond quickly to a child's needs throughout the night, without needing to fully wake up the way they would if checking on a child sleeping in another room. Some researchers studying infant sleep physiology have also pointed to possible advantages related to breathing regulation in very young infants when they sleep close to a caregiver, an area still under active study that, while it requires careful attention to modern safety guidelines around specific sleeping setups, suggests there may be real physiological reasoning behind the link between close nighttime, contact, and certain aspects of healthy infant development, beyond simple habit or tradition. Now here's a question worth examining honestly instead of assuming the answer. Doesn't sleeping close to several other people come with real downsides of its own? More noise, more disturbance, less personal space, all of which could work against good sleep rather than help it? This is a fair point, and honestly, group sleeping did involve genuine trade-offs. It wasn't a flawless, cost-free arrangement that beat solitary sleep in every possible way. Snoring, movement, and general disruption from sleeping near others were almost certainly common annoyances throughout human history, and people likely varied a great deal in how well they personally handled or adjusted to these disturbances. But evolution isn't in the business of optimizing for perfect comfort. It optimizes for overall survival advantage, and the benefits of security, warmth, and shared vigilance that came with group sleeping appear to have consistently outweighed the real costs of reduced personal space and increased nighttime disruption. If that weren't the case, this pattern wouldn't have remained so remarkably consistent across such a wide range of human societies that developed independently of one another throughout our evolutionary history. Let's bring psychology into this discussion as well, because there's a genuinely important, often overlooked aspect here that goes beyond pure physical safety, namely the simple, measurable comfort of psychological security that comes from not being entirely alone during one of the most defenseless states a person can be in. Researchers studying sleep psychology today have consistently found that a person's sense of safety and security has a real effect on sleep quality, anxiety levels, and hypervigilance. The need to stay alert to possible threats measurably interferes with the ability to fall into and sustain deep, restorative sleep. An ancient person sleeping completely alone in surroundings genuinely full of real dangers would likely have experienced exactly this kind of heightened, sleep-disrupting vigilance, simply because it was a rational and accurate response to the fact that being alone while unconscious really was dangerous. Sleeping within a group likely offered not just physical protection, but also a real reduction in the brain's threat assessment, allowing for deeper and more restorative sleep, since the brain could partially ease off its threat monitoring activity, trusting that other group members were providing some baseline level of shared watchfulness. There's also a genuinely interesting evolutionary angle here that connects this whole topic back to broader primate behavior. Since humans are far from the only primates that sleep in groups, and looking at our closest relatives helps put into perspective just how deeply rooted this behavior likely is. Many primate species, including a range of monkeys and apes, show a strong tendency toward group sleeping arrangements, often specifically seeking out elevated, defensible sleeping spots and clustering tightly together instead of spreading out across the available space. This widespread pattern across multiple primate species, all of which face broadly similar predator pressures and similar vulnerability while asleep, suggests that communal sleeping is likely a deeply conserved evolutionary strategy that goes back well before humans existed as a distinct species, rather than being some cultural innovation that developed specifically in response to uniquely human circumstances. Let's also address something genuinely important about social bonding and group cohesion, since sleeping arrangements likely served purposes that went well beyond physical safety and staying warm. Shared sleeping space represents an enormous accumulation of sustained physical closeness built up across thousands of nights over the course of a lifetime. This kind of ongoing closeness almost certainly strengthens social bonds, trust, and group cohesion in ways that occasional daytime contact alone likely couldn't achieve on its own. Sleeping near someone requires a genuine, practical level of trust, since you are voluntarily putting yourself in your most vulnerable state right next to another person, and choosing to do this repeatedly, night after night, functioned as an ongoing social signal of trust and belonging that likely played a real part in maintaining strong, lasting bonds within ancient human groups. Now let's set this whole discussion against the backdrop of the modern world, because the isolated sleeping arrangement that most people in industrialized societies now consider completely ordinary is, when placed in the full context of human history, actually a fairly recent and unusual development. Private bedrooms, solo sleeping as the cultural norm, and even the basic idea of children sleeping in separate rooms from their parents starting at a young age are all relatively modern arrangements, made possible by a combination of factors that simply didn't exist for most of human history. Larger and more elaborately divided housing, a dramatic reduction in everyday predator danger, artificial lighting, and security systems offering alternative forms of nighttime protection, and cultural shifts that placed a high value on individual privacy in ways earlier, more communal societies generally did not emphasize nearly as much. This connects to a genuinely interesting possibility that some researchers have raised regarding modern sleep problems more broadly. Could at least some of the widespread insomnia and sleep-related anxiety reported in modern industrialized societies be tied, at least in part, to this relatively recent and historically unusual shift towards sleeping alone, one that removes people from exactly the kind of socially supported, collectively watched-over sleeping environment our species spent the vast majority of its evolutionary history. Adapted to? This remains a genuinely speculative and actively debated area of research rather than a settled conclusion. Modern sleep problems clearly involve a huge range of contributing factors: artificial light exposure, irregular schedules, stress, and screen use, all of which have nothing directly to do with sleeping arrangements alone. Still, it's a genuinely interesting thread worth considering, given everything discussed throughout this video about how deeply this pattern of communal sleeping appears to be embedded in both human and broader primate evolutionary history. There's also a genuinely interesting angle worth bringing in involving sleep paralysis and dreaming, two phenomena that connect surprisingly directly to this question of vulnerability during sleep. During REM sleep, the stage most closely linked to vivid dreaming, the body undergoes a near-total, temporary loss of voluntary muscle control, a condition researchers call atonia, which stops a sleeping person from physically acting out their dreams. This marks the deepest and most physically defenseless point in the entire sleep cycle. A person experiencing REM atonia is, for those particular minutes, almost entirely unable to mount any kind of physical defense, no matter what might be approaching. Some researchers have suggested that the unsettling and nearly universal experience of sleep paralysis, a frightening state in which a person briefly wakes while atonia is still partly active, leaving them conscious but unable to move, might be connected to a deeply rooted, ancient anxiety tied specifically to this moment of maximum physical vulnerability. If REM atonia represents the single most dangerous stretch of minutes in an entire night's sleep, that's yet another genuinely compelling reason why having other alert, mobile group members nearby during precisely this period would have carried real survival value. Let's also bring in something genuinely important about how sleeping arrangements likely varied depending on the specific level of environmental risk, since, much like other topics we've covered, this behavior probably wasn't applied with rigid uniformity across every single ancient human population, regardless of circumstance. Groups living in areas with relatively lower predator density, or those sleeping in especially secure and easily defended spots like deep cave systems with narrow, easily watched entrances, likely faced somewhat less pressure to maximize how tightly the group slept together, compared to groups living in more open, exposed, and predator-heavy environments. This suggests that the underlying logic behind communal sleeping wasn't some fixed, universal rule that humans followed no matter the circumstances. It was a flexible, risk-responsive strategy that intensified or eased depending on the specific local threat conditions a given group actually faced, exactly the kind of adaptable behavior you'd expect from a genuinely useful survival strategy rather than a rigid, fixed instinct applied the same way everywhere. It's also worth mentioning something genuinely fascinating that connects this whole topic to how sound is perceived during sleep. Because human hearing doesn't simply switch off entirely while unconscious, as many people assume. Research into how the brain processes sound during sleep has found that the sleeping brain retains a surprising and measurable ability to respond differently to certain meaningful sounds compared to ordinary background noise. A sleeping parent, for instance, often wakes far more easily to their own child's cry than to other equally loud sounds nearby. This suggests the sleeping brain isn't operating on a single flat level of reduced awareness, but instead retains a genuinely sophisticated capacity for selective filtering, even during deep sleep. Within a group sleeping arrangement, this kind of selective hearing likely extended beyond just the bond between parent and child. Group members probably developed some degree of heightened sensitivity to specific sounds tied to actual danger, an unusual rustle or a particular kind of vocalization, compared to the routine background noise of other group members shifting position or breathing nearby, adding yet another layer of passive, automatic protection to the overall setup. There's also something genuinely worth noting about how this pattern connects to burial and ceremonial customs found at certain archaeological sites, offering an additional, indirect line of evidence for just how central physical closeness was to ancient human life, extending even into death. Numerous ancient burial sites from a range of unrelated cultures show multiple individuals buried together in close physical proximity, sometimes arranged in postures that closely mirror typical communal sleeping positions. While burial customs obviously involve their own distinct symbolic and ritual meaning, separate from practical sleeping arrangements, the recurring appearance of close, clustered positioning in both sleeping and burial contexts points to a deeply rooted cultural, and possibly even psychological, connection between safety, belonging, and physical closeness to other members of the group, a pattern that apparently carried over into how ancient societies chose to lay their dead to rest. Finally, it's worth pointing out that modern military and survival training entirely independent of any direct knowledge of ancient practices, has arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about sleep security purely through practical necessity rather than any archaeological influence. Modern survival and tactical training consistently recommends group sleeping arrangements, with rotating watch duties in genuinely hostile or unpredictable settings, essentially recreating through present-day necessity almost the exact same basic strategy ancient humans apparently developed organically tens of thousands of years earlier. This convergence is genuinely telling. When modern people, armed with full knowledge of current threat assessment, and with no cultural memory whatsoever of ancient communal sleeping customs, independently land on essentially the same basic solution when facing serious nighttime risk, it strongly suggests we are looking at a fundamentally sound and practically optimal response to a real, persistent problem, rather than some arbitrary tradition that ancient people just happened to settle into without any deeper reasoning behind it. So why didn't ancient humans sleep alone? Based on everything covered here, the honest answer comes down to a wide, overlapping set of practical benefits that made group sleeping the obvious and sensible default, given the actual conditions ancient humans faced. Sleep represented a genuine and serious state of vulnerability, marked by reduced awareness, reduced mobility, and a diminished ability to respond quickly to danger. And sleeping in a cluster directly addressed that vulnerability through overlapping watchfulness, shared body warmth, and the practical advantages of organizing sleep around a maintained, shared fire. Add to that genuine psychological security benefits, important developmental factors for sleeping infants and children, and the meaningful social bonding reinforced by shared nights, and solitary sleep starts to look less like some unfortunate limitation that ancient humans were simply forced to endure, and more like an option that almost nobody throughout the long span of human evolutionary history would have had any good reason to actually choose. And maybe that's worth thinking about the next time you find yourself lying alone in a dark, quiet bedroom, completely secure behind a locked door, in a heated house free of predators. That feeling of being totally and comfortably alone while unconscious is, in the full context of human history, a genuinely strange and genuinely recent luxury, made possible only by an enormous, relatively modern collection of safety systems that our ancient ancestors never had any access to at all. For nearly the entire history of our species, sleep was never meant to be something you did by yourself. It was something you got through together, one shared, overlapping, collectively watched over night at